All right, economics friends, welcome back. In our last video, we introduced and discussed the idea of the business cycle, those ups and downs of different length and different magnitude, those expansions and contractions that characterize most, industrial economies. We also then talked a little bit, we connected that business cycle with the idea of unemployment. Specifically, we pointed out that periods of decline, those contractions or those, really recession periods, those are going to be associated with increased unemployment. In this video, we're going to discuss unemployment in a little bit more depth, and we're going to specifically focus on some of the definitions, okay? A little bit of a warning, this one's going to be really jargon heavy, so get ready for that. Because in economics, and especially when it comes to the macroeconomic data points, terms that we use really loosely in the everyday world, in the world of macroeconomics, have really precise meanings. So we're going to be a little bit definition heavy in the next few minutes. Just make sure you really grasp that those definitions are critical and that the criteria for unemployed, for that term unemployed, means something very precise in macro theory. Okay, let's get into it. So, like I said, we're talking about unemployment. The term, that broad term, unemployed, it has a very precise meaning in economics. The term describes an individual, it has to be a person, aged 16 or over, who is not currently employed, is available to work, and critically, is actively seeking work. So again, the term unemployed implies a person aged 16 or over, that's the age cutoff, who is not currently employed, doesn't have a job, but is available to work, wants a job, and is actively seeking, looking for a job. Okay, it's not enough to just not be working. The economic definition of unemployment implies both the lack of work, but also the desire and the willingness to work. Notice also that depending on how the labor market is, the unemployed number can also imply those who are waiting to either begin or return to a job. So some types of seasonal work, for example, where you're off work, but then you come back on seasonally, or in other predictable time windows. When you're waiting for your next job to continue or to start up your new job or things like that, you're also considered unemployed, okay? But critically, unemployed, you have to be 16 or older, not working, you're open to work, you're looking for work, okay? Just like there's a specific meaning of the term unemployed, the term employed has a specific meaning in macro theory. Employed refers to, again, individuals age 16 or over, and here's the key to employed, who worked in the past week, even if it's part-time, or who are temporarily away from work. So if you have a job, but maybe you're on vacation or you're on some sort of medical leave, but you still have that job and you have the expectation of returning to that job, you are employed. Okay, so we have a very, very strict definition of unemployed, a very strict definition of employed. Together, the unemployed and the employed number, together, those two categories, employed and unemployed, they constitute what we call the civilian labor force. The civilian labor force, again, is a strict definition. It is the total of the employed plus the unemployed, which again, those two terms also have their own strict definitions. Okay, so the civilian labor force equals employed plus unemployed. When you look at it that way, you can kind of think of the civilian labor force as the economy's pool of either actual or potential workers. So you can kind of think of it as, what does the economy have available, either actually working or potentially working for its labor market? That's the civilian labor force. Another critical definition is the ACNI. The ACNI is the economy's adult, civilian, non-institutional population. The economy's adult, civilian, non-institutional, aka its ACNI population, that consists of the labor force, which we just defined above, plus the category known as not in the labor force. So again, the ACNI, the adult, civilian, non-institutional population, consists of the labor force, which we defined above, as well as what we would consider those not in the labor force. Note that the ACNI, it excludes certain categories. It excludes children under 16. That's the adult part of ACNI. It excludes active military personnel. That's the civilian part of ACNI. And it excludes those considered institutionalized, which may imply long-term hospitalized, or typically more commonly, those who are in the jail or prison system. Okay, so if you think about this idea of ACNI, adult, civilian, non-institutional, it's the labor force plus those not in the labor force. And that idea of adult and civilian and non-institutional would tell you that it's going to exclude children, active military personnel, and those considered institutionalized, either health-wise or more commonly in the jail or prison system. Okay? It's important to point out, by the way, that people, when we talk about these people who are not in the labor force, people can be out of the labor force for a lot of reasons. It can include retirement. If you're done with work, you put your time in, you're retired, you're not in the labor force because, again, you're not working and you're not open for work. People who choose to work in their own household, stay-at-home parents, or those that choose to work within the home, those would also not be considered in the labor force. Being a student, if you're a full-time or even a part-time student, and as a result of that, you don't want to work, and being ill or disabled. So there's a lot of reasons why people will voluntarily, or sometimes involuntarily, if you're ill or disabled, why people will choose to not be in the labor force. The idea of not in the labor force, therefore, needs to be looked at not so much in a judgmental way, but just to look at different motivations. But when you have all those reasons in, you get this group not in the labor force. That group, combined with those in the labor force, is your ACNI. Little chart here might make it a little bit cleaner. A lot of definitions, and I get that it's really confusing, a lot of jargon, so just try to keep it straight. And maybe a visual organizer like this might help you. So you see right here that we have the adult population. And that adult population, that's technically the ACNI, that would include those not in the labor force, as well as those in the labor force. And then this group that's in the labor force, in turn, would consist of the unemployed and the employed. So think of it as a big group that is then subset into smaller groups. And if you think about it that way, it'll make some sense. And we'll do a little bit of simple math and some calculations later on in class, okay? But for now, just know that's the way it breaks down. Adult population, not in the labor force, and the labor force. The labor force, in turn, unemployed and employed. All of those have specific terms, okay? Once you understand those terms, now you can finally get into your rates. We had said a while back that, the unemployment rate's really important, but you can't lead with the unemployment rate because you have to get the jargon first. But now that you know the different categories and the different jargons, now we can get through these rates. The first big rate, the critical one that we look at in macro, the unemployment rate. The unemployment rate is the percentage of the unemployed as a proportion of the labor force. Remember that when you're crunching out these numbers, you have to keep in mind the specific definitions that we spoke about earlier in this video. Okay, it's not just I'm not working. Remember that unemployed implies not working, open for work, available to work, seeking work, okay? So we're going to calculate the unemployment rate as the number of unemployed divided by the number in the labor force times 100. Again, the unemployment rate is the percentage of the unemployed as a proportion of the overall labor force. We derive that number by taking the number of unemployed divided by the size of the labor force times 100. You go back up here, you can see, for example, that there are 7 million unemployed. There are 153 million employed, and therefore the labor force has 160 million. Therefore, the unemployment rate, technically it's called the U3 unemployment rate because there's different metrics and measurements, but we'll just go with the unemployment rate. It is defined as the unemployed divided by the labor force. It's going to be 7 divided by 160 times 100. So we would say that with these numbers, the unemployment rate, 4.4%. Okay. Unemployment, we had mentioned, is tied to the business cycle. You see here a graph that shows the percentage rate of American unemployment over time. You see down here years. Notice that all these shaded areas represent recessions. So those shaded areas represent periods when real GDP per capita fell, aka the American economy was in recession. It's that economic instability that we spoke about before. And if you notice, it should be really, really clear, there is a direct correlation between recessions and unemployment. Unemployment rates rise when the economy goes into recession. And you can see it right there. Every significant upturn, here, 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 you get the idea. Every significant upturn in the American unemployment rate accompanied a recession. I also want to point out too that obviously unemployment is very, very difficult. It's a major social issue as well as an economic issue. When we talk about the unemployment rate, we always talk about it as like this big blended rate. The unemployed, all of them, divided by the labor force, all of them. And you get that blended rate. But it's important to point out that within that rate, there's a lot of variation. There's variation geographically, with some areas having chronically high unemployment. There's differentiation across gender, across race and ethnicity, and across age. So for example, you see here that male and female, about equal. But look at the difference here between the unemployment rate for 16 to 19-year-olds and that of 25 to 54-year-olds. Major issue when it comes to the age-based differences, and there's some structural factors that might cause that. You can see down here, I'll do it in red for some contrast, that there's significant differences in unemployment based on educational attainment. The unemployment rate blended was 4.9, But notice that that is really skewed heavily toward those who did not finish high school. And as you get more employment from high school and no college to high school and some college to getting that BA degree, unemployment rates fall. And you can also see that there's differences within race and ethnicity. This one only gives white and black numbers, but the same would hold true if you took a look at other ethnic groups in America. You're going to typically find pockets of unemployment that are pretty consistent with racial as well as geographical lines, okay? Notice that this one here took the white and black and then subbed it by age. So you can see that obviously we took the ones back here with age, and then we took here the race one, and you can get really, really, concerning numbers, for example, about differences among subsets. So white age 16 to 19 versus black age 16 to 19 unemployment rates. Now notice that to really suss that out, you'd probably want to take the next step and take a look at, for example, a geographic area and see if the overall geographical area has something to do with it. There's a lot of ways to go with stats and economics, okay? But that's just some basic ideas about the unemployment rate and about, where it's at now, how it's separated and kind of distributed unevenly across geographical, ethnic and racial, gender, and age groups, okay? Let's pull back. So we talked about the unemployment rate. That was our first big measurement. There is a second really important measurement in the area of unemployment, and that is known as the labor force participation rate. You don't hear about this one as much, but it's really important. The labor force participation rate, abbreviated to the LFPR. The labor force participation rate is the percentage of the population age 16 or older that is either employed or unemployed. In other words, this takes the labor force and divides it by the adult population. Again, the labor force participation rate, the LFPR, it's a percentage, so it's a rate. It's the percentage of the population that is 16 or older, employed or unemployed. Therefore, you calculate it as the LFPR is equal to the labor force divided by the non-institutional civilian adult population, the ACNI. Okay? I know it gets kind of confusing to take these two different metrics and make sense of them. So the best way to go about it would be to remember that they tell different but related stories. One way to think about it would be this. The unemployment rate indicates if you want to get a job, okay? The unemployment rate indicates if you want a job, how easy or difficult will it be to get it? A low unemployment rate implies a healthy labor market. So if you want to get a job, you've got a good chance of getting one. A higher unemployment rate implies a pretty shaky labor market. So if you want to get a job, you may have some issues. So consider the unemployment rate. If you want a job, how easy or hard will it be to find it? You can consider the LFPR. Do you want a job? So the LFPR kind of indicates the number of people who just want to work. The unemployment rate indicates for those who do want to work, how easy or hard will it be to get a job, okay? Labor force participation rate, again, the labor force, which is the employed plus the unemployed, divided by the non-institutional civilian adult population. If we go back up to our example here, we see that, let's go here for some color. The labor force participation rate is going to be the entire labor force here, that's 160, divided by the entire adult population, the ACNI, and that's going to give you 62.7%. Okay, so they're related, but they're slightly different. What's important to point out is that in America, over the last 20 years, the overall LFPR has been steadily declining. If you take a look at this graph, you can see a couple of issues, trends, we'll say. Number one, from 19, so we see here percentage, LFPR. You see the percentage here. We see the year, so starting in 74 and moving forward till 2019. Notice a couple of things. The blended rate has been steadily declining over the past 20 years. There's a few reasons for that. One of the main ones is that America is just getting older, and the baby boom population is now moving into retirement. And as you recall, once you're retired, you're not in the labor force, and therefore the rate is falling. But there's a few other issues going on that economists are really struggling with. One of them is the declining labor force participation rate for American men. Now, there's been a handful of articles recently that are really asking, what is happening to America's men? They're leaving the workforce. You notice that this decline in the rate of American men in the workforce is being offset primarily by the increases in the rate of American women as a part of the workforce. So again, we see some trends, we see some weird things that are tied to age and an aging population. We also have some sort of, at least for now, unknown social factors that are driving American men out of the labor force. Thankfully, American women are stepping in to fill that. But with all that said, the overall LFPR has been declining over the past 20 years. But that's in large part due to age issues as the population gets older and people retire. Okay? Anyway, so we have our two big rates, the unemployment rate, the labor force participation rate. I would want you to understand, number one, how to calculate them. Number two, what the different terms in each one mean. And number three, just kind of a general sense and a trend of what's going on within those rates. Okay? Now, with that said, I want to wrap up my discussion on unemployment with a couple of broader points. We know that unemployment's a major issue. However, and we know that when people can't find jobs, that can be both economically as well as mentally detrimental to people. Okay, unemployment has some really, really significant economic, but also social and personal tolls. It's not a good thing when you want to work to not be able to. It's very, very frustrating. It's very mentally debilitating for many people when you're unable to contribute, when you're unable to provide for those that you love, okay? So unemployment, we take it very seriously. But with that said, it's important to point out that in a dynamic economy like America's, where information is scarce, but also where people have freedom to move among jobs, there is some unemployment that is going to be inevitable. Okay, we will never reach 0% unemployment. It just won't happen, because in a dynamic economy that moves and changes and evolves and introduces new products, plus where people are free to choose among jobs and people get educations and quit this job to get a better job and get more pay, or where people move to a new location and they move their jobs accordingly, some unemployment is going to be inevitable. I would also encourage you to consider that although it's counterintuitive, some unemployment is actually positive. You think, well, we've talked about unemployment as being a bad thing. How can some unemployment be positive? Well, some unemployment is positive. For example, suppose that you wrap up your degree, you get your first job, you enjoy it. It's an entry-level job. You put in a couple of years. but then you basically outgrow that job and you're ready for something more, for more responsibility, to be a manager, to earn more money, to grow. Well, there's a good chance that you may need to quit that job that you have to look for something better. But if you think about it, that can be seen as a positive, because you're leaving something that you're not suited for or that underpays you given your experience that you're going to have, and you're moving forward to something better. And in fact, that can be considered positive because, for example, the unemployment that's related to you searching for a new job, it can lead to a better match between you and your job. And as a result of that, it can lead the economy to be more productive as you step into higher level, more intense jobs with more responsibility. So it's better for your future bosses. It's better for the economy. And there's a good chance that that's going to give you more income. It's better for you. So again, unemployment's kind of complex. You know, there's a lot going on jargon-wise and term-wise. We know that some is going to be inevitable. And now I just pointed out that some might even be positive. Okay? So there's a lot going on here. But at the end, it's important to bear in mind that at its core, especially when it's involuntary, for many people, prolonged unemployment can have some significant economic, social, and health impacts. And it's really important for you guys, as you study this and read through it and go through the book, as you get the economics of unemployment, that you always bear in mind that behind those numbers are people. And that those people, especially if they have prolonged involuntary unemployment, can really be hurting and suffering. Okay? And that's why macroeconomists and policymakers put so much time into thinking about this. Okay? So my friends, that's our overview of the economic jargon, of the big rates, the unemployment rate and the labor force participation rate. And then some final thoughts on unemployment, that while it's generally, when it's involuntary, a bad thing, it might be a good thing for some people at some times, and it's always going to be inevitable. It's a complicated phenomenon. In our next and final video, we'll break unemployment down into specific categories so that these concepts I just covered will make a bit more sense. Thanks for tuning in. I'll see you in a bit.